So let's move on now. Now that we have a couple of pieces on our artwork, let's think about measurement in the social sciences. So George Bornstedt of the American Institute's research was part of a panel, the Committee on Advancing Theory in the Social Sciences, with an intent to find common metrics in order to do that through the National Research Council. And George Bornstedt gave us the standards for quality measurement development. And for those people who've been using Bob DeVellis's scale development book, you'll recognize what's happening here. We move from the top row from left to right, where first we define the concept, we go through a progression of exploratory and then confirmatory factor analysis. We look at the internal reliability and consistency of the scales we developed. We might move on to an item response theory method. Dr. Lambert will tell us more about that. To think about fitting a RASH model, perhaps even a multi-parameter item response theory model to improve the precision of our construct measurement, go on to test the measurement of that construct and ensure it's invariant across subpopulations, and then refine it as time goes. But please take a close look at what I've highlighted in yellow. The foundation of measurement has always been the proper definition of the construct that we're interested in, as well as the domain of meaning for that construct. So it's at that point we have to ask ourselves, well, who should define the construct? Who should tell us what the domain of meaning is? And what we're learning here from Zubiri and Bonilla Silva in their book, White Logic, White Methods, is that statistics themselves don't prove anything. They're really just about the correlation of lists of numbers. And in fact, the statistics can't be racist on their own. It takes a human framing and a human interpretation to make them racist. And as such, humans can make them anti-racist as well, but we've got to interrogate the decisions that we're making. How will we interrogate those decisions? I'm recommending that we'll take a systems approach. So Donna Meadows is an environmental systems scientist, and building off the work of von Bertalanffy and others, Donella Meadows says that a system is any set of interconnected elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something. Think about what you know about system science. It's a parts whole science, understanding how the parts form wholes. And then W. Edwards Deming, considered to be the father of continuous quality improvement, tells us that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. You don't like the results you're getting, you've got to go into the system and figure out how it is that they evolve. We work with simple systems every day in our lives, like turning on a light switch and watching the lights turn on in the building that we're in or the room that we're in. But as social scientists, we're primarily interested in the dynamics of complex adaptive systems. These complex adaptive systems are part of that parts whole system science framework. The parts are often considered to be agents who learn and aggregate into higher order units. The higher order units also learn collectively while interacting with the environment through exchanges of information. Oftentimes, these systems develop regularities, patterns of behavior that might be called schemas that drive the operation of the system, and they adapt based on their learning in the environment, but not always toward fitness. The adaptation can actually be dangerous for the system. So David Krakauer of the Santa Fe Institute tells us that these complex adaptive systems can be considered as hidden in plain sight. And in fact, as human beings who participate in social systems, we are part of collective dynamics that drive phenomena that are observable. And those phenomena include racism and racist practices. So other system scientists have given to us the iceberg model to help us unpack and begin to understand how systems can be hidden in plain sight. So we might observe racial disparities above the waterline of an iceberg. You can see in this image, right? The iceberg has a tip and that's above the waterline. Everything above the waterline is easily observable to us. But below the observable events are patterns of events over time that are less easy to observe in a moment. And below those patterns of events are system structures, such as the way we organize our society, the laws we enact, the policies we enact, the structures that we create to guide our lives. But below those are mental models. And these are the assumptions and the values that each of us holds that aggregate up on a collective level to drive everything that's observable above the waterline. But these are not easy to see. We have to learn to see this system. We're very fortunate because Williams and Hummelbrenner have written a wonderful text called Systems, Concepts, and Action, which helps us to move ideas and concepts from system science into the field of research and evaluation design. And in particular, Hummelbrenner and Williams tell us that if we think systemically and we use system science principles in the design and enactment of our research and evaluation, we will be thinking about the interrelationships among components of a system. We'll be thinking about the multiple perspectives that different members of the system hold, and we will be thinking about the boundaries we draw. In this case, boundaries refers to things that we're choosing to attend to and the flip side of things that we're not attending to by making that choice. People that we're including to work with and people that we're not including based on that choice. So we can move this idea of thinking systemically into the measurement field by cultivating a reflective practice toward anti-racist measurement. And what I've done here is offered you a set of critical questions that each of us as researchers can ask and answer in teams of multiple stakeholder voices. We've got to get folks in who don't share the same biases that we share, who don't share the same training we share, and begin to ask these critical questions in order to move toward anti-racist measurement. So let's focus on the questions under interrelations, multiple perspectives, and boundaries. And in particular, up at the top, you'll see that I have clustered together instrument, participant, researcher, and project into a single unit by putting those forward slashes in. We might want to just think about, well, is my instrument racist? But as we learned from some of the snippets we pulled earlier, it's not the instrument that's racist. It's not the statistic that's racist. It's the particular use of measurement, which involves an instrument, a participant who's being measured, a researcher, and a project agenda. So we can ask ourselves if that joint interactive effect is situated in a history of racism. Where is it in a history of racism? And you'll notice I didn't mention diversity here. I didn't mention equity, because if we want to be anti-racist, I believe we need to start speaking and thinking about racism. And so understanding how our own practice as humans in a human system with racist dynamics, how our own practice might be situated in a history of racism. And then we can ask ourselves how this joint unit has the potential to disrupt or perpetuate racism. We also want to think critically about the multiple perspectives involved in our work. So as researchers and evaluators, who are we measuring? What are we measuring? And for what purpose? But how do the measured make sense of the practice? How could they inform our understanding of the construct and the domain of meaning in which the construct is embedded? How are the attempts to measure this phenomenon and the methods of measurement situated in a history of racism? And how might the perspectives of the measured and the measurer disrupt or perpetuate racism? The same is true for boundaries. We can ask these critical questions. What have we chosen to measure, with whom and how? And in making these choices, what have we left off the table? How is our choice of boundaries situated in a history of racism, and how might the boundaries disrupt or perpetuate racism? This is a reflective practice tool that any of us could use. And can you imagine if a journal started asking us to respond to these questions as we submitted a manuscript? So in summary, I wanted us to think about this as we did our decoupage practice. We're all agents acting in social systems with collective dynamics, including those that manifest as racism. To disrupt racism in research and evaluation, we need to learn to see the system that produces racism. It is hidden in plain sight in many ways. But a critical reflective practice based on system science principles can help us to interrogate our measurement practices and move toward anti-racist research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kainz. That was quite fascinating, and we look forward to the Q&A. A couple of questions for you. Next, we'll turn to Dr. Lambert.
Okay. What we'll be talking about today is item response theory linking and an anti-racist perspective in doing that. But before moving towards that, I will actually underscore that there are very few articles in the literature that address anti-racist measurement. In fact, I did a search before creating this talk, and I found probably about under half a dozen articles that address this. Most studies focus on comparative studies where Black and Indigenous people of color or BIPOC with middle-class Euro-Americans who are used as a gold standard with whom BIPOC are compared. When BIPOC people are studied, most measures used were designed by middle-class Euro-Americans and normed mainly on Euro-Americans. So one of my concerns about this is that BIPOC people are treated as an afterthought, where existing measures are retrofitted for them. This is done via translation, and if we're lucky, a test of configural invariance with little effort focused on metric or scalar invariance. And conceptual equivalence, which refers to whether the items making of a measure or understood to have the same meaning across groups, is almost always ignored. You don't see much of that in the literature at all. So metric invariance refers to whether a relationship between factors are identical across groups. Scalar invariance refers to whether different groups respond to a scale in an identical fashion. So depending on who you are and where you come from, you might respond very differently to a measure. Cultural validity is often ignored. So invariance studies are a step in the right direction, but cultural validity of measures designed by and known by middle-class Euro-Americans is questionable for BIPOC. Such studies often ignore cultural validity for BIPOC, and cultural validity means that the measure should be written in the vernacular that BIPOC individuals use and should reflect the reality in which they live. My reason for saying this is that I grew up in the island of Jamaica, hence my background. And I remember the first time I saw a test of psychosocial functioning. It was asking about snow. And I had never seen snow before I entered the United States in Philadelphia. So it was culturally invalid for me and others right off the bat. So how do we ensure cultural validity? This can be done in a couple of ways. One is to adapt existing Euro-American measures to be more culturally valid for BIPOC, and it includes changes in the language used and even adding items that are more relevant to BIPOC individuals. The other way is to build such measures designed by and for Black and Indigenous people of color. I'll talk a little bit now about how my team and I have addressed cultural validity. Modifying existing measures is one thing that we have done. I initially used the Achenbach system of empirically based assessment, or a CBA child behavior checklist, which is a parent form, and a teacher form, or TRF, and a youth self-report form to measure functioning in Jamaican children. It required transformation of some items that have different meanings for Jamaicans. So for example, whining, and some of the students that I've taught have heard me talk about this, wherein when we did our pilot, nobody said their child whined. And that was really surprising to me. And I've been away from home for too long. We know that whining is similar to that my kids used to do. It's like singing like an opera and going up and down. But in Jamaica, whining means something totally different. It means drinking too much liquor or engaging in a sexually explicit dance, which you would not expect children of that age to engage in. We also included a clinical record study of more than 500 children referred for clinical services, identifying problems that did not fit the ACEVA forms and adding more than 30 such items to them. For example, throwing stones at people, waste time, rude to others, begs, incoherent speech, or speaks foolishness. Speaks foolishness is one of the presenting problems that occurred quite frequently. The above referenced efforts might be considered a step in the right direction, but it still treats BIPOC as an afterthought and might still miss including important items. So I'll now talk a little bit about how my team and I have addressed cultural validity a little bit more. And that is to create new measures from scratch for Black and Indigenous people of color. One such measure that we created is called the Behavioral Assessment of Children of African Heritage, or the BACA, created by Black children and people who interact with Black children via focus group and a clinical record search of more than 1,000 Black children, where we went to the clinic records and see what they were presenting. The BACA is a measure of children's strengths whose items come from focus groups conducted with Black youth, their parents, teachers, clinicians, and others who interact directly with them. We ran probably close to 50 focus groups, including about a dozen people each time. It has two dimensions labeled resilience, such as adjusting to difficult situations, avoid doing things to make others look bad, behaves in a respectable manner, and has appropriate values. And self-regulation and pro-social behavior includes items such as expressing feelings, getting along with older children, getting along with younger children, getting along with adults, and also having good manners, which were really important to people in the focus groups. The behavioral and emotional problem scales whose items emerged from focus groups conducted with Black youth, parents, teachers, clinicians, and others who directly interact with Black youth, and a clinical record of more than 1,000 children referred for clinical services. It has 8 dimensions labeled anxiety, such as anxious, avoids public, attention, hyperactivity, problems, such as acts of fool. You don't see that on most measures, but it was important for people in our focus groups that be included. And incomplete tasks. Then we have conduct problems such as bullying others and a doesn't care attitude. We have hypomanic, manic, for example, dangerous behaviors or hypersexuality, depression, bottle things inside, not communicate, oppositional defiance, a person gets agitated easily, or a person is mad at the world. Reality, contact problems such as surroundings seem unreal, or the person seems like they're in a different world. And then self-destructive behavior, which refers to harming self or attempting suicide or other harmful behaviors. So we extended this work to the Caribbean Symptom Checklist, which is designed like the BACA to have both strengths and problems, with input coming from focus groups and more than 600 clinic records of adults that we looked at in the Caribbean. Like the BACA, conceptual validity came from clinicians who practice in the Caribbean region. We didn't rely entirely on the statistics that Dr. Kainz reported. We first had people who work with children, not with children, but with adults in the area, group these items according to dimensions that they seem appropriate. And they came up with aggressive antisocial, such as attacking family, throwing objects, anxiety, afraid of leaving home, fears bad things will happen, attention deficit hyperactivity, trouble finishing tasks, or jumping from task to task. Depression, for example, crying easily, feeling dead inside, hypomania, mania, boisterous, raucous, or racing thoughts, and psychosis, rolling sensation in the head, or one feeling like their body is no longer their own. Even when using a measure designed for one set of Black youth, if such measures are used to assess Black youth across countries, there is potential bias. Methods presented here to address this can be used to ensure anti-racist measurement. This is done by item response theory, in my case, a set of theories that produce and procedures used to assess the probability of a particular response to items measuring a specific trait. There are several IRT assumptions, such as appropriate dimensionality, conditional independence, and selecting the most appropriate model. Once assumptions are met, IRT can be used to place items on an identical scale, even if items differ to reflect cultural validity. They must have items that are identical across groups that have no significant differential item functioning. Items without diff are constrained using the test correctness curve method, which places them on an identical metric. Linking is especially important in youth assessments because the gold standard is that youth are often assessed by parent, teacher, and youth informants. So it's really important that all reporters are rated on the same metric, and IRT linking can facilitate that. When youth across different socio-ethnic groups are assessed, they should be rated on the same metric also. It complicates linking informants and socio-ethnic groups, since linking must be established across such groups and such informants. This is just a quick example of linking. You notice that the columns represent the database with items. In each column, items are depicted in uppercase. Arrows connecting identical items across adjacent group reflect that such items have no significant diff across groups. These items are constrained across their respective groups in partially constrained model. If item groups represent the same unidimensional construct, it's not necessary that all item sets across each group are identical or even have identical number of items. Moreover, items without significant diff are required to be identical across adjacent groups. So they don't have to be the same across group. They just have to be adjacent in order to do that. And I'm close to being done. So the case of our Jamaican African-American youth, we both are rated on the BACA resilience scale. Items were modified or dropped for Jamaican youth to reflect cultural validity. Items were linked across informants and countries. And in IRT, we have what we call a test response curve, which gives you a global picture of where the test is actually measuring and how probable is a response to those test items. You notice that the curves are different for African-American Jamaican parents, Jamaican youth, and also African-American parents. That is before linking. Once we link them, we put the test response curves together. They came together really neatly. And linking really allows us to do that. It meant that in both countries, some items were dropped for Jamaican kids and items were added. for them, but because of linking, we're able to make those culturally valid for each group, and also be able to measure them on an identical metric. So in conclusion, there's a paucity in the literature about anti-racist measurement. Measures used are usually developed and normed on Euro-Americans, and BIPOC are often an afterthought. Usually addressed by configural invariance and less so in metric and scalar invariance, especially when groups are compared. Cultural and conceptual validity are ignored. My colleagues and I have contributed to addressing this problem by modifying existing measures and creating new measures designed by and for Black and Indigenous people of color. IRT linking permits equivalence even when two or more groups have different items that are culturally valid for them. And just some references, and then I'm done.
Thank you, Dr. Lambert. So we have, last but not the least, Melissa Villodas. So just want to remind everyone, we will have time for Q&A. So just hold your questions, and we'll get to them after our last presentation. You may also put the questions in the Q&A section as the presenters present.
All right, can we see that okay? Yes, okay. Excellent. So I'm really excited to share this morning, especially after Dr. Kainz and Dr. Lambert, who have been formative in my own anti-racist research and measurement. So I'm happy to have heard from them alongside what I will be presenting. So this afternoon, I'm happy to share with you all on a paper that my co-authors and I wrote, examining a neighborhood cohesion measure among African-American youth living in public housing. So I hope that what I share today helps to provide an example of how to orient ourselves to anti-racist measurement and research. The study I'm presenting to you was supported by the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities Research Training Program, and does not necessarily represent the official views of the National Institutes of Health. And to start, I just want to bring us back to what Andrea shared last week on what anti-racist research is. So the quote says, "Your research is anti-racist when it prioritizes and seeks for the safety, dignity, and humanity of people of color over the growth and enlightenment of the researcher and the majority." And so this research seeks to build clarity on the use of a measure that we can work toward improving our understanding of the neighborhood cohesion, as well as collaborative work toward building cohesive neighborhoods to foster a positive mental health. So as social science researchers, we know that precise measurement is key to the meaningfulness of any scale. And it's particularly important for the development of effective policy and intervention for understanding phenomena to the best of our ability. But studies exploring how minority youth understand measures of community cohesion in particular is absent from the literature. Neighborhood cohesion is a multidimensional concept that refers to the trusting social relationships and shared values and norms of neighborhoods and their residents. And neighborhood cohesion has been identified as an important mediating and moderating mechanism between adverse neighborhood conditions and health and wellness. But unfortunately, this concept of cohesion has not been found to serve as a protective factor among Black youth in the same way it's found to be among white youth, which makes this concept incredibly important to understand from the perspective of Black youth. So it's likely that neighborhood cohesion has not been found to be an impactful protective factor for Black youth compared to other youth because research has not adequately accounted for the stressors that impact Black youth disproportionately, particularly Black youth living in socioeconomically disadvantaged neighborhoods. Literature states that Black youth are disproportionately represented in impoverished neighborhoods and are more segregated by race. And Black adolescents have rated their neighborhoods as more threatening than other youth. Additionally, some more prevalent risks in Black communities that contribute to poor mental health outcomes include racial segregation, racism, discrimination, threatening environments, among others. And these are all aspects of how someone may experience their environment. Living in public housing in particular comes with unique policies that residents must adhere to. So this includes dire legal consequences related to drug use and even eviction in the event of a missed utilities payment. And so additionally, many public housing developments are epicenters of drug markets and are scarred by violence from drug markets produce. So given that public housing has these specific regulations and other potentially detrimental effects, it's important to study the measurement of neighborhood cohesion among African American youth in public housing, because how we understand its impact among Black youth is different from how we understand its utility as a protective factor between neighborhood-based risk factors and mental health outcomes among other groups. So this study aimed to produce psychometric data on the modified neighborhood cohesion instrument among African American youth living in public housing using an exploratory factor analysis, or an EFA. And it also aimed to evaluate the empirical and theoretical meaningfulness of the modified neighborhood cohesion index within this understudied population by conducting a confirmatory factor analysis, or CFA, and by testing the construct validity. So four steps were taken to address these aims. First, descriptive statistics of the sample and an examination of the items on the NCI, as well as key variables, were examined. Second, a EFA was used to examine the factor structure with African American youth. Third, CFA were used to test the relationship between observed variables and their underlying latent constructs of neighborhood cohesion. And last, we tested convergent and discriminant validity. So the study sites for this paper included New York City and Philadelphia. Each of these sites sampled from 2 public housing developments in each city. In New York City, there were a total of 127 buildings in the 2 developments, and in Philadelphia, there were a total of 60 buildings between the 2 developments. Inclusion for this study was that youth had to be between the age of 11 and 20 and residing in the identified housing developments. The flyers, recruitment cards, and announcements at community centers were used for recruitment. And the NCI was modified by a community advisory board before the surveys were administered. The key measure, the Modified Neighborhood Cohesion Index, consisted of 15 items and was developed for use in geographically bounded neighborhoods. The measure is a synthesis of 3 concepts, including psychological sense of community, attraction to neighborhood, and social interaction within the neighborhood. It has shown good internal consistency within adult samples of European, Canadian, African American, Latinx, and East Asian in previous studies, with the reliability ranging from 0.67 to 0.97 across those studies. Some sample items in the scale included, I feel like I belong to this development, and I believe my neighbors would help in an emergency. And the scale was measured using a Likert scale from 1 to 4. Additionally, self-efficacy, depressive symptoms, and neighborhood risk were additional variables that were explored due to its theoretical relationship with neighborhood cohesion. Self-efficacy for its theoretically positive relationship, and neighborhood cohesion, neighborhood risk and depressive symptoms were alongside for their inverse relationship with neighborhood cohesion. So within the sample of 259 youth from 2 cities, the age of respondents ranged from 11 to 20 with a mean age of 15.5. About half of the sample identified as male and 48.3% of the sample as female. Mean scores and standard deviation for the neighborhood cohesion scale within each city and across both cities combined are presented on the table on the right, and this is being recorded, so you can check that out later. And so in terms of the results for the first EFA, it indicated that a 2-factor structure was recommended based on the scree plot and based on eigenvalues greater than or equal to 1. However, only one item loaded above the 0.3 minimum cutoff onto factor 2. And generally, it's recommended that a minimum of 3 items load onto one factor. In addition to this, 2 items loaded below 0.3 cutoff for loading onto either factor. So the items that were loading poorly were, I rarely have neighbors over at my house, and I would like to move out of this development. And so those 2 items up on the top left were dropped. So the EFA was run once more with 2 items dropped and 1 factor. And factor loadings for the second EFA are displayed over on the right side on table 2. And as you can see, the remaining 13 items loaded above 0.3 in that second EFA. Additionally, KMO and Bartlett's tests were conducted to ensure the suitability of the data for structure retention, and it yielded results in acceptable ranges. And the internal consistency of the NCI and other key variables were very good or acceptable. Next, a series of CFAs were run to obtain the best model fit. The initial CFA was conducted with those 13 items from the EFA with no modifications or error covariances. And so within the first CFA, none of the fit indices fell within the acceptable threshold. And so a second model was run with the 13 items and with 3 error covariances suggested by the modification indices. Error correlations occurred between items 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and 9 and 15, which are displayed on the top left. And the final chi-square and RMSEA model fit indices were still found to be unacceptable, but the CFI was acceptable in this second CFA, meaning that there was some inconsistency across fit indices. And then finally, when testing construct validity, depression and self-efficacy were weakly and not significantly correlated with neighborhood cohesion. And neighborhood risk had a negative and statistically significant correlation with neighborhood cohesion as expected. So given the findings, differences in the number of factors, as well as the need to drop 2 items, may signal low cultural validity of this scale among the sample based on age, them being youth, and or location, living in public housing. And the 2 items that were dropped due to poor loading, I would like to move out of this development and I rarely have neighbors over my house, likely didn't resonate with the experiences of the youth living in public housing neighborhoods. So for example, the decision to move out of a neighborhood is a decision made by the youth's caretakers. So the idea of moving out may not have occurred to these youth. Additionally, fit indices were still unacceptable and didn't meet the recommended values for chi-square and RMSEA, despite letting the items co-vary. And then in terms of construct validity, the NCI did not meet good construct validity, despite historically being associated with improved self-efficacy and serving as a protective factor against depression. Some limitations to note is that this data is specific to public housing communities in 2 US cities located geographically in the eastern region of the country. And youth included in the study were limited to those who obtained parental consent and those who responded to recruitment efforts of the local community centers and flyers. But despite these limitations, this work highlights the significant differences in social contexts experienced by African-American youth living in public housing and the need to acknowledge those contextual and cultural factors in measurement-focused research. And this data demonstrates that differences found across groups might be more deeply investigated by examining measurement differences across populations that are understudied. So without further adapting the NCI or developing validated neighborhood cohesion measures specific to African-American youth living in public housing communities, researchers risk making assumptions about the effectiveness of the mediating role of neighborhood cohesion between neighborhood risk and mental health outcomes. And so as such, researchers must develop and utilize measures that are informed by or tailored to the lived experiences of Black youth and their communities. Valid and reliable measurement is imperative when researching understudied populations, and the findings here demonstrate that there is a need to develop neighborhood cohesion measure that captures the unique experiences of this population. And I think generally in light of anti-racist research in particular, this study demonstrates the importance of work that prioritizes safety, dignity, and humanity in Black youth, in particular, as we seek to understand neighborhood cohesion and work toward co-constructing this with a population that we care very much about. And those are my references, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Lambert, Kainz, and Elisa Villodas. So we do have about 14 minutes for questions. I already see a few in the chat, but I'd like us to start with those who have raised up their hands. I think Dr. Let me see. If you're ready to ask your questions, why don't you raise your hand? I thought I saw a hand earlier, but it's gone. So we do have Jirej. I hope I got your name right. I will allow you to talk. I think you're enabled. So please feel free to ask your question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I put my question in the chat as well, either way, but thank you so much for this very interesting series of talks. I'm someone who's coming from a very different background. I'm an engineering educator, and I teach a lot of kind of linear algebra, machine learning, engineering design courses at a very large scale. Often my classes have thousands of students in them. And what we unfortunately have sometimes is a very skewed demographic in our classrooms. And we have, for example, very few Black students in our classrooms. And I'm interested in designing interventions and, building tools, software tools even, to support students from minority backgrounds in our classrooms. And of course, to understand whether these are valid or not and how well they're doing, I need to measure. And I'm wondering if you have any advice on how I should go about measurement in this context, given that it's different from the kinds of examples that you guys have discussed, but I'm sure that there are things that I need to be considering, but since this is not my background, I'm really looking to experts to understand what I should and should not be doing.
Good. Thank you for the question. I'm sure many others on the call do have similar questions. So panelist, who wants to go first?
Well, I can respond, and I'd like to know if the questioner is from UNC Chapel Hill, and there's a reason I'm asking.
I'm not. I'm at UC Berkeley, unfortunately.
Lovely. That's okay. We have email. I want to connect you with Liz Chen, who's in our School of Public Health. And the reason is Liz develops apps for youth. And she's got a wonderful paper she just published in Digital Health, where she talks about her measurement, her design of the instrument, and her measurement practices, because she's working with a diverse group of adolescents who may or may not find a health app acceptable or worth using. And so that said, and it kind of gets at a question that Rain Massa also put in the chat, like, are there other ways of measuring things? And so, yes, there are. And so what Liz did involved some design processes, involved some usability testing, and then eventually a formal measurement process. But the formal measurement process didn't supersede the other things she did. They were all ways of learning more about the group that she was interested in working with and producing something that was useful to them. So if you can send me an email and I'll connect you with Liz.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
So, Dr. Lambert, do you want to respond to Dr. Massa's question? I think Dr. Kainz mentioned that, so maybe you can tag on that, and then we'll move to the next question.
I didn't see Dr. Massa's question.
Oh, okay, so let me read it here. So it says, is it possible to move away from the dominant Eurocentric measurement methods to practices that recognize multiple cultural orientations of measurement or research activities? Are there alternative methods that are not rooted in white supremacy or Eurocentric values, particularly the notion that there are objective and quantifiable methods to measure a behavioral or social construct?
Okay. I think there are. I want to go back to what Dr. Kainz said about statistics, and that statistics are not necessarily racist, but can be used as tools in terms of measurement. As I mentioned earlier on, in terms of what I have done, is rather than relying on more Eurocentric type of measures, is to actually go and talk to the people so that they are invested in the measure in the first place. And also, the measure is not necessarily designed by myself and my colleagues, but really come directly from the people.
Mm. That's quite helpful, and I know this is a short session, so I encourage you to follow up with any of the panelists for further discussion. There's a lot of expertise in our school, and so we'll be happy to connect with some more folks. Want to go to Neil Villodas, who is with GSDI, and then we'll come back to the Q&A section. So Neil, you may go with your question here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciated it. I think I'm building off of the previous question, but I guess, we're talking specifically about measurement here, and I wonder how measurement in the context of the actual research relationship connects. For example, statistics, it's been said statistics aren't racist, but if we as researchers go in there with our pens and clipboards and use quantifiable, objective, positivist data to then inform theories and disregard or don't prioritize sort of reciprocity and relational ethics, I wonder how, not regardless of the measure, but I just wonder if the measures are consumed in this bigger epistemology of research, right? And knowledge production. And so I just sometimes feel like, in a school of social work, we as a collective are sort of up against this neoliberal academy that wants us to just produce, and is much less interested in the relationship. And so I think what I'm trying to get at is that I find myself in dilemmas around not doing research for the sake of research, but doing it in a relational way that is actually beneficial. And I'm a white man, so I have these extra layers, but I think research is a dirty word to a lot of communities. And so I just wanted to bring that in. Thank you.
Good, that's a good thought, and I think a lot of us can relate to that. I wonder what any of the panelists wants to comment on that.
Well, I just love it when somebody references ontological diversity, right? We're coming at the world from different starting places, different mental models, and time spent ahead of any project, research or not, kind of figuring out what are the assumptions I'm moving forward with, and do they match the assumptions of the people I want to engage with? Great opportunity.
Good, so we have about 5 minutes, so we can take some more questions. There is a question from Caroline for Melissa. So this is for you. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but I'll read it here. It says, thank you for these presentations for Ms. Villodas. I may have misunderstood, but I thought you indicated that the measure you tested had previously been modified using input from community members. Is that correct? Would you change that process in some way in hindsight?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So the measure was adapted by community stakeholders in the community center. I think if there was anything that I would change in the process, and I'm coming from this in a secondary data analysis, I think involving, like Dr. Lambert was mentioning earlier, involving the youth in that process as well, allowing them to see the questions and get an understanding of how they interpret the questions before using those questions to try to get an understanding of how they experience neighborhood cohesion. So I think it's really important to involve several people as part of the process. So the research team is one set of people that you can use in the process, stakeholders, as well as the individuals you're studying, to get a sense of their lived experience as well, and their understanding of the questions that are being asked.
Yeah, thank you. There is a question from Kathleen Malley, and I wonder whether Dr. Kainz can respond to that. I'll repeat parts of the question. So it says that one issue that often comes up when we plan analysis are the limits of many statistical methods to account for a lot of groups within an analysis. I think Neil referred to some of that. It says, what are some developments that have been made in this area lately?
Yeah, Katie, I think that that's a very astute question, because I think if I understand the question correctly, you're saying, you know, let's say we collect data from 10,000 people, they're our sample, perhaps we think they represent a population. There's a lot of diversity within that sample. And are we prepared to explore, acknowledge, and work with that diversity? And, you know, if I run a linear model, I hope some of my regression students are here right now. If I run a linear model, am I just going to blow past all of that diversity? Am I going to use covariate adjustment to say, well, holding all these things constant as if they don't matter? Or am I going to figure out a method to do it? And so I think we don't have to abandon quantitative methods if we want to get into the diversity, but we probably need to think carefully about what's the theory that we're operating from? Does the theory help us to see the diversity? It's getting back to Neil's question. What assumptions are we actually bringing to the engagement here, to the research activity? Are we able to actually conceptualize the diversity? One thing that I've enjoyed, and I can see my friend Kate Gallagher is on the call today, is having an iterative back and forth plan. So sure, there's the analysis we do, but then we present it to the people who actually provided the data to us and ask them if they think that that was the right analysis, if they think the findings are representative of what they were trying to tell us, and allow that to go back and forth until we get at some of that diversity. Now, everything we're suggesting takes a little more time than we typically have, right? But I think that those are the conversations we want to start. So Katie, thank you so much for that question.
Okay, great. So we think we're almost out of time. We have 1 minute. We do have Emma Kainz. We'll let you have the last word because you have Dr. Kainz's last name. So you get the last chance here. Why don't you go ahead? Let me see. Oh, Emma is no more. Okay. So I was going to give the last word to Emma, but I think she's no more here. Okay. So we will, I think this is probably a good time to wrap up. It's just 1 p.m. here. Just want to thank our panelists for the wonderful job. Measurement is a critical topic. You know, as the way you develop your measures will inform the data you obtain, and that then informs how we practice or the policies we put in place. So this is a crucial topic. We just spent 1 hour on this. I encourage everyone here to follow up with our panelists. If you have specific questions, you will also get a link to complete a survey at some point this week, and so we'd love to get your feedback on this. And don't forget, we do have one more webinar that's next week, same time, 24th, February 24th. So we hope to see all of you back for that session. Thank you, and please let us know if you have any questions. Just stay in touch. Thank you.